At this time, we'd like to convene the Finance Committee meeting of the City Council for Tuesday, September 17th, 2013. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Chair Burt.
Here.
Councilmember Berman.
Here.
Councilmember Schmidt.
Here.
Vice Mayor Shepherd. Here. 4 present.
Great. Our first item is public comment on items that are not otherwise on the agenda, and we have no speaker cards, so we'll go ahead and proceed. Item number 1 tonight is the Library Bond Oversight Committee Quarterly Report. Good evening, Lalo.
Good evening. Lalo Perez, Chief Financial Officer. Thank you, Chair Burt, members of the Finance Committee. I wanted to give you a little bit of a background on the first item. Per direction of a prior Finance Committee, and obviously you can change that direction as you choose, we were asked to include this item more as an informational for you to review. If there were concerns or questions of the committee, you would then let us know, and the thinking was that the committee would come at year-end financials unless there was something drastically amiss where you wanted them to come at a next possible meeting. So the only area that I wanted to report that I think it was important to the committee, the Oversight Committee, for you to note, and it's explained in their cover letter to you, is that they were concerned about the cost increasing associated with the Metro Park Library and Community Center and getting close to the bond measure and threshold of $76 million. And I think you're well aware, staff has been briefing you on this item, but I think it was important for them to note to you that they were watching that line as well. So unless there's a need for you to have a scheduled Oversight Committee to attend, this report is just for information for you to review.
Great. Colleagues, questions or comments on this? Councilmember Schmidt.
Let's see, a question. I guess these reports have been coming in. Is the Bond Oversight Committee a Brown active committee? Do they meet in public? Is there?
I'm not absolutely sure. I would have to check on that, Councilmember Schmidt. I know that they meet during the day, what I would call our daytime hours, meaning staffs, during the weekday, but I am not sure of that. We would need to look at that.
I guess I'm just struck by the fact they are an oversight committee, so hopefully they'd be providing council and the public with some oversight over what's going on. But I look through the report and it's hard to garner much from it. On page 30, for example, they have the reports from the last 2 years on the Mitchell Park Library, and all it says is that payments were made. Now, is there oversight merely that a payment has been made to a stated party, or is there some discussion about are these payments accomplishing a goal?
Right. I have not attended every session that has been held. I've had staff from my department attend, as well as Public Works staff who leads the meetings. And there's been questions in terms of meeting the target, and especially early on when issues surfaced. And I did hear some of those questions, but I can't tell you for a fact what the discussions have been in the last few meetings because I have not been present myself. What we could do is, if there's an interest, we could re-agendize if you wanted to have a more in-depth discussion as to what type of discussions are going in the meeting, because unfortunately I have not been present at those meetings.
May I partially respond? Councilmember Schmidt, you may recall that when the issue of the cost overrun above the bid, not above the original engineering estimate, came forward to the council, and the council raised significant concerns now, what, a year and a half ago, At that time, not only did the council then request regular detailed reports on all of those activities that we've had in both open session and closed session, but we also asked about what was the role of the Bond Oversight Committee. And I think this question was asked and answered. And my recollection is that it is a more limited role. It's not tasked with doing the function that we're now doing as a council because of the problems, which is to scrutinize and question and even challenge and then move forward on policy decisions around these important issues that are happening here. So I think it would be fine to get an update on that, but I'm a little hesitant at a year and a half after it was asked and answered that we kind of revisit it as if it's a new question.
I'm not sure it was completely answered, and my focus is on the future. If we face, I think it's by ordinance that we have this bond oversight committee for each major bond issue. And if we have another one coming up, if we do form an oversight committee, I think it would be helpful to be clear from the council perspective what benefit we should expect to get from an oversight committee.
Yeah, it's a good point, and my recollection is along the same lines as Chair Byrd, but that doesn't hold back somebody from potentially asking for status and staff being able to answer. But my recollection was the role was very limited and defined, and it's part of the requirement that we have. I was updating the city manager through this process, reminding him that this has internal controls within Public Works, and then within my department that there's multiple sign-offs on the payments and transactions. There's it's a, like the committee would review, it's difficult to tell from a single line item as to what's exactly going on without the context of the discussion. Yeah. I did hear from the city clerk that it is a Brown Act committee.
Okay, so I think it would be useful maybe before we move into another bond issue that we do have a discussion about the role of the oversight.
And I agree that that's a more useful discussion than going back and revisiting, because I actually was a council member who specifically asked this question in public and received answers at the full council meeting. So we can review those meetings. It was a concern of mine, but it was asked and answered, and about this committee.
Yeah.
I do agree that going forward in the future, that's something to review in terms of the future roles of other similar committees.
Can I respond? I did look up the municipal code. It's Municipal Code 2.16, and it's generally about boards and commissions and how they're appointed, not specific to library bond oversight. So I guess once we enacted it, it follows our Muni Code here. So if you want to, it's right
well,
here. It's very general, though. It's just, how you appoint and stuff. So it's not, there might be, and Phil Boble is the liaison to it, so from Public Works.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments on this item?
I did. I had one. I just, sorry, let me see if I can get back to my finance committee. I noticed that on a couple of the change orders, we've got a lot of change orders for LEED green building for both the Mitchell Park Library and I think downtown. I'm coming up with, downtown. Those are all bondable, I'm assuming, even though that looks like they're change orders in addition to what we went out to contract for.
Right. The general direction that we've been given by bond counsel has been that as long as it's a fixed and a permanent part of the structure, it's, that's the general guidelines that it is bondable.
Okay.
So, you know, when it gets a little gray, then we obviously reach out to bond counsel and clarify.
And so roof replacement is also one of the items, when you've kind of given us a little bit of snapshot. I'm looking on packet page 6. So I would think roof replacement might be a maintenance item. I'm just curious. I'm sure everything's appropriately expensed here and drawn from our bond, but I was just wondering if you could maybe just take a double look at that, because I'm thinking that is possibly digging into the engineer's estimate. I don't know if we actually went out for the bond for those things, or if that was something that we layered into it later and then decided that, well, we've got money because we have an engineer's budget that we've been able to spend less money on. And the situation with the financial works with going out to bid, you know, bids came in lower than we had expected.
Definitely. Let me look, because I cannot speak to the item specifically without giving you factual information. I do know in a couple of briefings and tours that I've taken that we had to redo some work, so I don't know if it's associated with redoing of work, and that's why it's labeled as such, but I will double check and get back to you.
Yeah, fixed equipment's another one where I thought we were not doing equipment with the bond, but that would be in the Mitchell Park Library.
Yes.
So anyway, if you could kind of double check that and maybe answer it via email.
Certainly.
Sometime this next week, that would be great, just to make sure that we're spending what we're supposed to be spending on with what we went out to the people for.
And I don't think it's specifically equipment, it's furniture and fixtures that is outside of the bond.
Correct.
Right, this is fixed equipment, so I wasn't
Right.
sure what that meant. That's 1.7 million.
Right,
so,
and I'm just simply
yeah.
saying, the statement that equipment is outside the bond, that's not my memory. It's that it's furniture and fixtures, which would be a subset of.
Yeah, they typically call it FF&E. That's
My
a
interest
short.
is just like if we're getting up to the line of getting to what the engineer's estimate was and the expense that we had explained to the community we were going to go and bond ourselves for, I just want to make sure that if we are putting more things in, that maybe we need to reconsider some of that as capital improvements from our own general fund budget instead of from the bond dollars, so that we can make sure that we have surety that we can, you know, manage to get through all the projects with what we said we were going to do.
Very well. We'll respond.
Good. So that concludes item number 1.
Do you need a motion on that, though, or? No, it's just-
No, it's really an
No.
information item.
Information. And so our next item is approval of the fiscal year 2013 reappropriation request to be carried forward into fiscal year 2014.
Thank you, Chair Burt. I want to introduce, I think most of you may have met Walter Rossman by now, our new OMB director, who is going to lead items 2 and 3. So I'll turn it over to Walter.
Thank you, Lalo. Good evening. Walter Rossman, OMB Director. The first item we have today is the reappropriations for fiscal year 2013. In the report which you have in front of you, we request the committee's concurrence to carry forward funds in various projects and in several funds due to delays and direction to staff, and then forward your recommendation to the full council. In general, there are several reasons why we have reappropriation requests, and they are because staff wasn't able to complete the work. We had vacancies throughout the fiscal year. It makes more sense to align certain projects together so that it's better to work together for staff. For instance, we just talked about libraries. We have delayed the acquisition of library material until the libraries are completed. We don't want to purchase them in advance before we actually can receive the items and shelf them on in our libraries. And then obviously we have some programs, which is mainly utility funds, lower than anticipated demand, such as a rebate program for the storm drainage fund, or a multi-year energy efficiency loan program, which the council approved a few years ago. The last item which we have is we're asking to move forward or carry forward management professional development funds across various departments in order to have additional funds available in fiscal 2014 for urgent training needs for staff. We plan to come forward and admit to you specifically to the council for appropriating those funds. The attachment to the report identifies the project which you have seen. It recommends the reappropriation amount and the funding source, a description of the project, as well as reasons for delay and timeline for working on the project. In total, $600,000 in general fund funded projects that has to be carried forward, and $2.3 million in all funds. To provide more context for you, in fiscal 2012, we carried forward about $1 million in general fund dollars. That's what the council approved, and about $9 million in all funds. This concludes my review. Staff is available to provide more context on specific items if the committee so desires.
Great. Colleagues, any questions or comments? I don't have any speaker cards. Councilmember Schmidt.
Just to put this in the context of the budget,
Sure.
help me understand these numbers. We have an item in the budget, operating transfers in and operating transfers out, which is quite substantial. I assume this is part of that?
No, what this is, these are funds which are not reflected in the budget as adopted by the council. These are funds which we had in fiscal 2013, and we asked them to carry them forward to fiscal 2014.
Right, but they would show up in the 2014 budget
They
as
will once you
operating
approve this.
transfers in. Is that right?
Go ahead.
No, you got it.
They don't show up as a transfer. What they show up, they'll show up in the specific funds where they're currently housed. So in 13, excuse me, with the capital fund and utilities, it will show up again in the capital fund. So that's a transfer, but it's a reappropriation of funds. So it's not a transfer between funds, it's just a carry forward from one fiscal year to the next fiscal year in a particular fund.
Because you haven't spent the money, right?
Because we haven't spent the money, that's
Yeah.
correct.
You're in the middle of a project.
Can I try to ask your question slightly differently?
Yeah.
I just wanted to, I think I have the similar question, Councilmember Schmidt. Does it show up as a 2013 expenditure in terms of, for budgetary reasons, but is carried forward in a special fund, and on a cash basis, it is expended in 2014, but does it move actually from the expense side of 2013 to the expense side of 2014, or does it stay in the expense side of 2013 and we show the expenditure in 2014?
It is not expended yet because we haven't yet haven't yet started projects. We're in the middle of this project. So it doesn't show up as an expenditure. It actually shows up really technically, it drops to the unrestricted ending fund balance. That's where it houses, because it's unspent funds. However, it's appropriated for a certain purpose by the council previously. And then we carry it forward for the same purpose in the next fiscal year. So, and then hopefully we'll spend it this fiscal year, that's the intent of staff, and then you will see it as an expenditure.
On the
Unappropriated.
revenue side then, for 2014, it will show up as a revenue under operating transfers in. Is that right?
What we'll do is we'll adjust the budget, and when we give you the first quarter report, you'll see a line item for reappropriations and a line item for encumbrances. So this is the reappropriations, and we'll see an addition of this amount if you were to approve these dollars. And then, so that'll be the revenue source, trying to tie it into what you're thinking there. And then the specific expenditures will be in the department categories, and all of this, the two net to zero.
So I will look for that in the
Yes.
2014.
Yes.
So it moves over on both the expense and the revenue side to 2014.
Correct. It's a source and
Yep.
it's a use, correct.
Gotcha. I had one question on an item, on the police utilization study. It mentions that it's carried over because of competing workload demands. Were those demands, the competing demands in the CSD, the city manager's office, or the police department? Where was the competition, and what's the resolution to that?
It was mostly in the police department. You may recall they had a significant amount of vacancies in the department, and the management staff alerted us that it was probably going to be challenging to get this completed. And so what we suggested was that they included as part of the reappropriation so that can be in the work plan for 2014. And since then, they've added some resources. They've added officers to fill the vacancies. So, and Walter's here to help me too, to help see what we can do to help the police department get this RFP on the street so we can get a consultant to come in and do the work.
So you had said it would be difficult to get it completed. It sounds like it hasn't been initiated.
That is correct.
So do we know approximately when it would go out for bid and how long it would take to complete it? Well, when it would go out to bid, when it would be awarded, and then after that, how long to complete the study?
So that timeline could be, 3 to 4 months, depending on how quickly we get the scope of services done. Oh, okay.
It's the answer man.
I didn't turn
Saved by the bell.
quite back far enough.
Good evening, Ian Hagerman, Senior Management Analyst in the Police and Fire Departments. So right now, we don't have kind of an RFP in the pipeline. This is a project that's of particular interest, I think, to Assistant City Manager Tam Antil. And so I think our position is that, and it was last year, that with the number of vacancies and the significant demands that this project would have on our technical services division in particular, that division is responsible for implementing our new CAD system, our new RMS system, which are probably the biggest technology projects we've undertaken in about a decade. And so the police chief has kind of prioritized completing those successfully prior to kind of initiating this study. I mean, we are interested, I think, as a department in actually doing this study. I think that it'll show that we do a really good job. But I think that the priority is getting these two significant projects in place and kind of well positioned. And so that CAD project is scheduled to come online later this year, and then RMS probably about a year later. And so we will have some bandwidth to kind of initiate that. But these are very data heavy reports, and those are the same folks that are involved in these project implementations.
So Ian, that sounds as if it's not going to make fiscal year 2014 either.
Well, I wouldn't expect that the project would be completed in this current fiscal year. I wasn't around when the fire utilization study went on, but it takes some time just to get the data and cull through it and kind of work through a pretty substantial project. And so I think our hope is that we might be able to get it started this fiscal year, but we're already a few months deep, and there's not even, as far as I know, part of an RFP process in place.
Well, when you just described the timeline for these other two major projects, which I wasn't fully aware of, and probably others of us weren't as well. If I followed it correctly, it sounded like the second of those would carry over at least into the end of this year, if not into the beginning of fiscal year 15. Are you saying that these would occur in sequence, and so that this would not be initiated until that second one is complete, or is there overlap?
Yeah, I don't think that there is necessarily an inability to kind of start before the RMS project is completed. I think that just given the kind of totality of that work, that it's difficult to begin now without some of it kind of coming off. And so, we're actually going out, we're signing a contract which will be coming to the council later this month for the RMS system, and so they'll start that development of that system.
RMS stands for what?
Records Management System.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the CAD's where the calls come in, records management's where the data sort of sits. And so as CAD kind of comes online, that will free up some resources in our technical services division. And then as the police chief, I think, senses there's some bandwidth in that group, can get more comfortable, I think, initiating this project. But it is something, I think, as a department we're interested in undertaking it.
So the department's interest in undertaking, is that the initiative for doing it, or did that come from the city manager's office or a council endorsement? What's the genesis of this?
It came from the city manager's office, directive through the last year's preparation of the budget. It was aligned in the thinking that if we've done the fire study now, maybe it's time to review our police services as well.
Okay, so I appreciate and respect these other two major projects. I am a little concerned by a sense that there's an acknowledgement that there's some interest in doing it within the police department, because I don't think that's what initiated it. And so I feel probably comfortable in accepting the timeline that you described based upon the prioritization, but I'm concerned that I'd like to see an acknowledgement of the importance of this proceeding on a prescribed timeline. And from what you've said, I don't know whether we're even going to commence it in 2014, and pretty clearly not complete it. So I guess I'd like to ask for just a greater clarity to come back in terms of these 3 major projects, and what would be the timelines involved and what's anticipated as far as you can't do 3 at once when what was the first one? Was the
CAD
the
project,
CAD,
right?
yeah. So as the CAD gets completed, and you think that'll be completed about when?
We're anticipating kind of going into a beta phase later this calendar year. And so the hardware is kind of online, or just getting that ready. But I think to add to those projects, I mean, those are 2 of a substantial list. I mean, we're also replacing the mobile audio video in all of our police cars. We're getting 7 new police cruisers, which are brand new models that are going to have to be outfitted later this year. We're looking at taser replacements. We're investigating body-worn cameras. I mean, there's a number of incredibly significant technology projects that all have to be prioritized, I think, in the context of that study. And so I think that it may be helpful for this committee to sort of see the entire array of what that division in particular kind of has on its plate, so that it can be prioritized.
I think that would be good. These various technology improvements, I think, are extremely important, and it sounds like a pretty aggressive program that's going on there. I think part of the sensitivity is over the comparison to the fire department services study, which I believe was delayed for 6 years before commencing, and that was a big deal. That doesn't mean that the need for this is comparable to what was the need there, nor the reasons for the delay are comparable. But I think that's part of just what there's a sensitivity for us to have transparency, and if it can't commence until a given date because of these competing demands on other technology projects, then we just all see that, we accept it, and it's not perceived as it got just kicked down the road, but it literally had a defined set of competing priorities, and everybody understood it, and we're all looking at it together. And sometimes there are other alternatives for coming up with other resources. We may find that we will change nothing in terms of the program and the sequencing that you have there, and we completely accept that. But I think it would be valuable to have that all just laid out so everybody understands it, and that there's no later. I mean, in a sense, it's also important for the police department, so that with that transparency, nobody can come back later and say, oh, gee, they were trying to avoid doing this study, because it was all transparent and accepted, and I think would be a good way to go about it.
Sure. If it'd be acceptable to you, maybe we can look at including that schedule when this item goes to the council, assuming it's approved through tonight, and I can talk to the chief tomorrow, and we can work with Palo's group to get that.
That sounds great. Does anybody else have any thoughts on any of that? Or it's okay? Good. Good. Thank you. So it appears we don't have any other questions or comments on this, this does need a motion.
So I move we accept the report recommended to the council.
Second.
Any comments?
No?
Nope.
If not, straightforward.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
That passes unanimously. Two
Thank
down.
you. 2 down, one more to go. So the last thing which we want to discuss tonight is a continuation of the cost of services study. I have here with me Gail Wilcox, who's sitting in the audience back there, and Jeff Wakefield. Jeff Wakefield is MGP consultant. Gail Wilcox has really led this effort in the last 2 years. So let me first give you a little background on about the study itself, where we are, what I hope to discuss with you today, and what the report is about. First, I want to give you a background about MGT and the report itself, the reasons why we started down for cost of services study about 2 years ago. Then I will want to introduce to use of the cost recovery policy considerations which you've seen in the report, which will frame how we move forward with the setting of fees as part of fiscal 2015 budget process and thereafter. And then share with you the cost recovery percentage ranges, which we looked at and I recommend for you to consider as well. As you know, there's a multi-pronged approach to long-term financial viability. One of them is obviously looking at expenditure reductions, service level changes, outsourcing, employee cost sharing, which everything Palo Alto has done during the last few years. And the other one is also looking at revenue increases, with restrictions for revenue increase, which you're well aware of through various propositions approved by the voters, and including fees. We also have restriction there. We cannot ask for cost recovery fees, which is above 100%. And looking at public-private partnerships, and also looking at internal support functions, which the committee asked us to do in the March report, the March committee meeting. So if you look first, as we go through this report, at the draft MGT report, it really, what it did is updated the fees for us. It worked with staff and incorporate the full cost of providing fee-related services. What that means is you have obviously various components of any kind of activity which city staff perform in support of fees. So you have the staff time itself, you have the time of compensated absences, which gets a rate attached to this, you have the overhead rate within the departmental administration, you have an overhead rate with it to support, to pay for city support functions such as ASD or HR or IT, and et cetera. And then what MGT in this report did, it's calculated cost recovery percentage based on the activity level, which we have on each fee, using FY 2012 actual data, and saw what the cost recovery level is, what the general fund subsidy is accordingly. The methodology, which was discussed quickly, was reviewed by the Finance Committee in March 2013, and it's just important to know that this report does not include any kind of fees related to planning, community, environment department, and development-related fees in other departments. The main reason is that we've been working on trying to figure out how to structure development services as adopted by the budget and create a separate department. As part of that, you need to isolate the costs first. Once you isolate the cost, to figure out the activity level on the various activities the staff provides to development community, and then set the fee accordingly to achieve 100% cost recovery level. If you look at the next slide here, you see percentages which averages cost recovery levels per MGT for using FY 2012 data. As you can see, that there is definitely a possibility of potentially increasing increasing revenue for the general fund, but this is always to provide context to other policy considerations, which we're recommending here to you today. And a side note, it's important to state that this represents about 650 fees. The city has about 1,000 fees, and the balance of the 650 to 350 are the development-related fees. Now, what are the different cost recovery policy considerations we're proposing for you today? One is the community versus private benefit. If we look as an example, we have a fee at the city, which is a 45% cost recovery level, which maintains, or where fire department goes into a building or into a business and inspects the fire prevention system. Particularly, the owner of the building is the one who benefits the most for having it maintained and certified, versus the community at large also has a benefit, because if there's fire prevention for this particular building, it doesn't affect neighboring buildings or other businesses in the neighborhood. And it also reduces the cost of services or the need for fire department services. But regardless, the majority of the benefit rests really with the building owner. If you look at the service recipient versus service driver policy consideration, this is important for a building permit as an example. If a homeowner adds an addition to their house, it has to be done in according to certain building codes in order primarily for fire prevention, make sure plumbing is correct, electrical is correct, etc. The benefit there is really, or the driver for this is the building code, which says we have to build buildings in a certain way, it could be energy efficient, etc. but the recipient is really the building owner. They get the primary benefit again because their building will be built according to standard. It will prevent for the longevity of the building, as well as prevent any future fires or other kind of issues with the building. Then we have the issue of consistency with city goals and policies. The city, for instance, has in community service department a policy to support low-income youth, disabled adults, or seniors. So we also have to consider, as we set the fees, how do we adjust for these kind of policy considerations or directions which the city councils give us in the past. Then there's the issue of elasticity of demand, which obviously is what happens if we provide too much of a service. Then we'll be bringing residents from other areas into our city in order to take the service, especially if the cost is too low, or if the cost is too high, and there's a negative elasticity of demand, that this will have a negative reaction from the community to take advantage of the service. So that's another policy considerations which we need to look at. And lastly, is the service available from the private sector? So do we have, for youth and recreation classes, we have YMCAs, we may have nonprofits provide the similar services, and how do we fit in as a city or as a public agency in the overall picture of the marketplace? So based on those various policy considerations, what I'm doing in the next slide, I'm overlaying cost recovery levels into low, medium, high, within certain percentage ranges, and relationships to those policy considerations. If you don't mind, I'll just take a sip of water. It's dry now. For example, if you look at low cost recovery level of 0 to 30%, the city does not recover any cost control services. And there's a reason for that, because we don't want anybody not to call the police department. If we were to say, well, we'll charge 5% for the call, and the neighbor sees another neighbor's house getting robbed, they obviously would not call, because they would be charged with the cost. So this is a very extreme and perhaps absurd example, but I think it sort of signifies why we have low or no cost recovery levels for certain services which the city provides. If you look on the other side of looking at a high cost recovery level, as I mentioned, the homeowner receives the primary benefit for a building permit, or the business permit receives the primary benefit for certifying or recertifying a fire prevention system. And really the medium range, it's very difficult to identify, and if you even look at the table before, which I showed you in 2012 data, the majority of the fees on the overall level are within the medium range. Because cities, these fees were set in consideration of many different parameters, and therefore the staff needs to analyze this based on this policy consideration or framework, which we're presenting here today to you. If you look at the next one, it's the next steps. First, there are certain fees which NGT identified in the 2009 report which were above cost recovery levels, some quite substantial. So we are looking into those fees right now. I'm working with staff to come up with a process which is hopefully simpler but still labor intensive on identifying costs and related activity levels and revenues for those fees. So a pilot for ongoing development and review of those fees in future budget cycles. 34 fees we're looking at. If there are any kind of fees which we may have an impact, if to bring the fee costs down or the cost per fee down, then we'll come back to the committee in November and bring this forward to you. The other thing which has been discussed in the past was the first responder fee. We also plan to bring this forward to the Finance Committee November 13. Based on the input today and decision by the Finance Committee, we plan to bring the City Council consideration of the user fee cost recovery policy. We bring the user fee recovery policy for City Council consideration to the Council in November. And the main reason why we try to expedite this process and set the policy framework was in December we're going to start working with departments to already setting the fees for the FY 2015 proposed municipal fee schedule. And one item which we also need to come back to you is looking at internal support services, whether it's ASD, HR, or IT, or other internal support functions, and see how we can deliver the services differently. That's what the council asked us, or the committee asked us to come back, and we plan to do this in December 2013. With that, I just want to quickly look at the recommendations which are in the report. Number one, acceptance report is presented to you today, including MGT's draft report. Provide input on the user fee cost recovery policy considerations, which is summarized quickly for you just right now. And then, if agreeable, with further comments from the committee, direct staff to bring forward a policy for user fee cost recovery to the full council in November, which will guide us to develop the FY 2015 municipal fee schedule. This concludes my report.
Thank you. And we don't have any speaker cards. Colleagues, questions or comments?
I'll make a comment. I have one question. But first, I want to compliment you. I think this report really was well done. I liked the way you articulated how and described how you were going to consider the different services. It actually helped me focus as a council member how we operate as a public municipality. And so that was, I think, well done. And I'm assuming that this is reports that other cities do, so it's not like it's repeatable, you know. But on the other hand, we did get to look at it, and I thought that that was great. And so thank you for that. My one question is that I noticed that parks are responsible, this is just your side note that I think you know where it is. The park expenses go to ASD, not ASD, services.
CSD.
Thank you, CSD. But the animal services has to do fields, and I didn't understand that. What are you talking about that they're doing fields? Is there a field for this is $500,000, $560,000, or is that all the public school fields? I just wanted to understand.
That's field work which animal services staff does. So when an officer goes out and checks on
that kind of
animal
field
which
work.
is abandoned, that kind of field work.
Thank you.
Correct.
I'm very glad. You just kept repeating it. Well, maybe you should consider describing it differently, because I'm sitting here thinking, really? Because, you know, we're not allowed to let our dogs run on those fields. So. Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
I appreciate you.
Okay. I won't make a motion because I'm sure others have questions.
Councilmember Berman.
I don't have any questions, but I just want to say I thought this was really helpful as well. It makes a lot of sense to break up the different services that we provide and identify the purpose of providing that and what we as a city want to get back. So, you know, I've got no comments, nothing more nuanced than that, but I think this is a great idea and I was happy to see it, and I think it makes a lot of sense to take a step back and do that analysis.
Thank you.
Councilmember Schmidt.
Yeah, I think go along with my colleagues that this is a nice policy context before we get into the details. The overall diagram you have on page 63 gives a sense of your recommendations working very differently by department. That the fee increases, the revenue leveling going off to 100% affects fire, police, public works, has no impact on animal control and community services. So two different points that come out of that. One, the leveling off in police, fire, public works. These are mandated laws that the city has passed. Fire inspection control, better building standards. And I note that the gap between what we're currently charging and what we'd have to charge is quite substantial. So if you look at the fire prevention page,
That's correct.
the very first item there sort of jumps out. Goes from 300 to 1,100.
That's on page
7.6.
76, correct.
Yeah. Now, I guess we want people to do this. They're doing it for their own good, enhance the value of their building. But they are also doing it, I guess, for the public, because these are commercial buildings where the public, either as workers or buyers, are moving through and we're protecting them. So, does 100% make sense there? A little bit of concern of this is a substantial increase in, cost of building. Will it discourage updates and buildings that we want to encourage. So in these cases, why should the goal be 100%?
Okay, let me first address two things here. We're not proposing to, for instance, increase the fee in 1 year, even from 27% to 100%. That would be too much a shock. Okay, any kind of, if you have large substantial increase, it should be phased in over the years. The second thing is, it really falls overall development service, or this kind of work, which is fire installation modification, should be in a high cost recovery level, which is between 70 and 100%. So the policy framework really is, it should be high, but it doesn't have to be fully. Now these recommendations here come directly from the consultant, what they have seen in other cities, what has been done. But it doesn't necessarily mean that Palo Alto has to follow that way. I do believe, though, it should be at the high recovery, high cost recovery level.
Yeah.
And I do believe also that we cannot make a jump from 27% to 70% in 1 year. There will be, everybody who's out there needs to, and this is only, we have 225 activity levels, so 225 permits are issued there in 2012. So you're asking suddenly 225 businesses, I assume that's mostly who are affected here, to pay, so $300, $700, $800 more.
Yeah.
And so this needs to be phased in, the business community needs to be taken into consideration, and what else they have, and also to be outreach done. Every time we do this, here's how we're going about this for Sunday from one day to the next. Yes, they paid $300, and tomorrow you're paying $1,100.
Okay, so that's good you had that policy in categories with quite a spacing in there. And I think the notion of moving over time to these products makes sense.
And that was another reason the Finance Committee asked us to keep this in a draft mode, because you wanted to have the opportunity to review this activity, to review the recommendations of the consultants, and then try to mold your policy based on what fits best for us in Palo Alto.
Yeah. So that's one side. The other side of the coin are, let's call them the service programs, animal service and community services, where you recommend no increases in fees to take place. Now, there's a nice thing on page 95 where you have some detailed discussion of how you think about why community services, or some of the community services, should be charged less than others. You mentioned children's programs, seniors programs, I think in other words, handicapped. But when you look at community services, you're dealing with a healthy, thriving population. Swimming, tennis, arts, theater. Some are children's programs, but you get into your teens and so on. So it gets fuzzy and gray. And then why these programs rather than, gee, suppose someone wants to start up something else. Should they get the same treatment? So it's a fuzzy agreement where we're putting people into the 0 to 30. And sometimes it's good to say, oh, this is little kids and this is for older people, but the vast majority of users of the programs are the residents of the city, or the middle class citizens growing up in a middle class community. So how do you talk through or think through
Sure.
the justifications?
Sure. I believe where the average cost recovery levels are for these type of communities of this type of work, let me just take a look at the front page there. For CSD, it's about 30% right now. That's true. Okay. There are a lot of variations within those programs. You have the activities, which you talked about, council member, and you have others, which have a high and a lower cost recovery levels. The way the city has really addressed the adult disabled, the seniors, low income, and low income youth. It was a separate program. For the last fiscal year, we subsidized an additional $30,000 to give these kind of members of the community a lower cost to access those courses and services. So one perhaps needs to see, and I agree with you, how this particular course, as an example, an arts class, how does this compare as offered by other entities, nonprofits? How does it compare to the marketplace? And are we substantially below? Are we right there? So that's one consideration. And then how can we attract perhaps low-income residents to this by having a separate program for them?
Yeah. Yeah, if you look at page 82, you have the cost of services for the community services group. And if you look at the last column, full cost recovery percentage, there's some there with 1%, 0%, 2%, 3%, 2%. And you go down, there's a list, and there's others, 68, 66, and 29, and 35. So the range is pretty, and I can't get from your statement of, oh, here's the way we think about it, poor people, senior people, handicapped people, to those
Sure.
numbers.
Okay, that's helpful. So if you delve a little bit deeper here, you have one huge item is arts facilities. So the way the consultant looked at that, if we rent out an arts facility, how much are we covering from that? So how much is the lease we're charging towards using this facility?
Yeah.
That alone, the $1.3 million, from an average perspective, drops down percentage quite a bit. But I think rather what I would do is of looking at the overall CSD, I would look within groupings within the department. So looking at recreation, adults, teens, etc., and looking at that grouping of classes and recreation activities which we offer, and then looking perhaps leasing facilities, which is a separate grouping, or looking at the community theater, etc., and the zoo. So I think we need to look at. So what we probably haven't told you this yet, but when we come back with the proposed fee schedule in 15, is really present to you cost recovery levels, which you haven't really seen yet as an annual budget item or as part of the annual budget process, where we're doing groupings of these various activities. And instead of perhaps giving you a cost recovery level for a particular art class, giving you a cost recovery level for art activities, or cost recovery levels for recreation activities as a grouping, so that you can see that's where we stand, that's where our fees stand, and you have a better feel how much the general fund really at the end is subsidizing these kinds of services to the community.
Yeah, one thing you could add in there too, somewhere here, I don't have it at the moment, you have attendance or enrollment
Yeah, that was
in the
back.
program.
All the way back. That's
90,
Last page.
98 or something. Yeah.
And there it's very clear that while you might have a couple thousand kids in the theater program, you have 20,000 people from the town who go to the theater. So it is a benefit that goes beyond just the kids enrolled in the
Right.
program. The art, again, how many people go and see some of the art around town. So I think that would be a good thing to integrate into your assessments of how, what impact it has on the community.
The other components to consider as well as part of the discussion that we had at the beginning of this process with you was seeking opportunities for public-private partnerships, where as a result of the data comes out. In addition, maybe potentially reaching out to the community in
Yeah.
terms of surveys of the services that are being provided in either a ranking or a level of desirable, of the level of services. In other words, if you may have swimming classes, but let's say, I'm making up numbers here, you have 10 classes. Well, in order for this to be at a better cost recovery level, we need to increase the fees. Would you be willing to pay an additional blank to get to that fee? So working with the community to see the level of desirable levels of services, it's also a potential that can be incorporated in this process.
Or the number of people and the amount of contributions that come in in support of activities.
Yeah.
Is a good indicator.
And then you as a council could also say, you know, there's certain core services that are the fabric of this community, and they're going to be subsidized because that's what we believe in, and then we have set that policy, and then that goes forward too.
Put a little advertisement in the end. We are engaged in Coverly discussions, and Coverly is the community center for half town, and one of the criteria here should be is our community services providing services throughout the community. So Coverly becomes an important issue, and that should be taken into account when you think through.
Correct, because that, as you well know, that has a process of its own, and depending on some of those decisions that are made, that will influence our recommendations on the fee setting as well. Specifically, to be more clear, if we enter into a long-term agreement and we decide to renovate some of the facilities, then maybe there's a cost-sharing component with the tenants, for example. Not necessarily saying that that's what we should do, it's just something we would need to consider and looking at.
Yeah, but it's an important goal to achieve. Yes.
Raina Halpern, Assistant Director for Community Services. I just want to shed a little bit more light on some of these numbers, especially where they're really low. So the year, we're still on page, what is this?
82.
82, yes, thank you. So unfortunately for the Art Center, the year the numbers were assessed here, the Art Center was closed. So that's why under arts facilities, you're at 1%. The Art Center in FY13 was open for 8 months and exceeded the revenue it generated for the last year it was fully open. So that number is skewed. I also, just going from the top down, the Children's Theater Council has entertained charging a pay-for-play and decided not to. So Children's Theater, it keeps that revenue down. JMZ has no ticketed gate. That keeps that revenue down. And you can see Art in Public Places, of course, doesn't generate revenue at this point. The community theater, the council has decided at 3 different dates, the last in the 90s, to keep that subsidy for the 3 theater partners at 0, so that keeps that down. And then you can see, of course, the summer concerts, Theater Works, Palo Alto Players, and West Bay Opera. And, yeah. Okay, and then summer concerts has also been something that council's really supported for the community event. You'll see under visual arts youth and adults, those are both class programs that do really well. Again, these numbers are skewed because the Art Center was closed, and they have, again, in FY13 exceeded revenue expectations. So anything visual arts, numbers, you have to take that into consideration. Under art exhibitions, that gallery space is free to enter, so by definition, it has no revenue attached to it.
It wasn't open anyway, right?
And it wasn't open anyway. Right. And then, of course, the music and dance programs, we could expand a lot more if we had some more physical space, when we think the opening of Mitchell is going to really help that. Those numbers are also already good. So I can keep going through, but I just wanted to kind of give you that flavor on it. And also with the opening of Mitchell, you'll see some more revenue coming in for facilities rentals.
And we can do more than one pass on this, because I'd just like to say that I think this is our main topic tonight. We've been waiting for this for some time, and I'm actually a little concerned that we're somewhat rushing through something that is of a greater concern to the community and to us as council members than maybe perceived. And I think we should spend some good time on this. But so just having said that, Councilmember Berman.
One number that just jumped out to me is on the community theater line. The total indirect expense is astronomically more than the total direct expense, which is an anomaly versus all the other items. What are those?
Yes. We did have 1.5 FTE at the community theater, and during budget reductions, it was cut to 0.34. So that's why the direct expense is so low. The reason why the indirect is so high is because of maintenance of the facility.
So kind of a one-time thing, or is this annual
Ongoing.
maintenance?
It's a big building.
That's
It's
Lucy Stern
ongoing.
Center.
That's the community theater at Lucy Stern.
Yeah.
We have
Yes.
a colleague.
That's Gail Wilcox from ASD. The allocation of public works maintenance and custodial charges are allocated based on square footage. And so there's almost $400,000 of cost in there just for that.
Yes.
So it's maintenance and custodian.
Yes. And things like rats and wasps and things like that, too.
Drive them out of there into my neighborhood. I've been hearing from neighbors down the street that the main library construction has caused a rat infestation in surrounding homes.
Seriously?
Yeah. So careful when you redo the community theater. All right. Councilmember Berman, did you have?
There's this one, I mean, briefly bringing it back to what you were talking about earlier. I mean, I think a community survey to determine kind of community needs and desires on services, as Councilman Schmidt mentioned, you know, was a big topic of discussion with the cover lead process, and I think is something that would help us get a more concrete understanding of, you know, what the wants and desires of our residents are. That would also help kind of influence some of this information, I think. So I mean, I'm a big proponent of that. Cover lead's kind of fallen off the map, and I'm not sure what the process is with some of that stuff, which we'll be discussing, I think, fairly soon. But, you know, to the extent that it helps us in this effort also, it's a, you know, two birds with one stone kind of effort.
Yes, and that's why I wanted to make sure that it was back on your radar to consider. And I think, Chair Bird, you raised a good question. Our suggested timeline was basically that, a suggestion. There's nothing forcing us to stay to that schedule. If the Finance Committee wants to keep this item at committee level and continue to work through the rest of the calendar year, there's no reason why we can't do it. At this point, our fiscal year 15 budget projection is that we will have a balanced budget. So there's not a fiscal driver, if you will. It was more merely responding to the committee's request that if we were able to get something through 15, what would it take? And that's what it would take. But that doesn't mean that we cannot change or alter the schedule to ensure that we go through the process that you would desire.
Well, I think there's two levels of discussion. The staff recommendation number 3 suggests that we tonight would recommend that staff bring to the council in November a draft user fee cost recovery policy. And that, we're not reviewing and adopting that or recommending that tonight, right?
No, we were more thinking that you may have some general guidelines that you would instruct us and give us for us to work and come back within that context. But if you rather have that come back here, there's no reason why we can't do that.
And when it comes to vote on that, that's my inclination. I think it's part of our task to try to flesh that out and then make that specific recommendation to council, which they can accept or reject.
Right, and again, it was just merely trying to meet the timeline of the budget process, but there's nothing that says that we have to do that.
So those are at some of the higher level, and then I actually think that it would behoove us to spend more time even at a next level down on some of these issues, because we as a council are hopefully going to be attuned to and reflect the community values. And part of that is not only our own sense of that, but how do we deliberately, as we go through any changes, reach out to the community and hear from the community in a broad way. As a finance committee, we've seen many times where, especially in recent years, where we've gone through difficult budget decisions, and if a particular kind of constituency that is supportive of a a portion of the budget, if we've had to go after cost reductions in that area, we have very strong community response from that particular constituency. Well, we're really talking about a whole lot of constituencies here. And my sense is there's an underestimation of how this would ultimately be received by the community. And it's one of those things that we could go through and have 10 meetings like this and have very little community response until the word finally gets out that such and such a program that is highly valued by segments of the community is going to have major fee increases, and people will come out of the woodwork and be unglued, and a community uproar, and how could we do this without informing the community? And we've kind of gone through this process on a number of things. We're going through it on development projects right now, and this community is one that at the end of the day, we have residents who just deeply value living in this community and the services that are provided by this community. They assume that they will continue along the lines of what they've always had, and changes to those are very sensitive matters to big portions of the community. And so I don't want us to be lulled by, what do you have tonight? Good attendance, almost all by staff or the press. And the community's not here. And because we haven't really gotten into these open discussions about how this might affect their programs. So I'm actually quite concerned that we are being lulled into thinking that this will go over easy. And we need to have more discussion on it.
So if Councilmember Chair, if I could just jump in for a second. The intent is to look at the fees for FY15. We haven't billed them yet. We don't know what the costs are for those fees. It's something which we need to do annually. And one reason I haven't mentioned this yet is Prop 218 and 26. Really, every time we reach closer to 100% cost recovery, let me make sure we're not overreaching. And really to make this as an annual process. As part of the annual process, and as we bring forward recommendations to the council at that moment in time can always look at and see whether those cost recovery changes, meaning the increase in fees, are palatable or not. So one thing as part of the policy considerations which you may want to consider tonight is, and I have not put in there, is how can we balance, which you mentioned, Chair, the need for the potential for increasing fees with also the shock value. That's what I tried to address with Councilmember Schmidt, that perhaps another thing which your committee could bring direct us to do is to gradually phase in any kind of fees. If there's any kind of fees which are jumping substantially, to give advance notice so that you already have kind of policy discussions in advance. At the same time, what we've done the last few years, as you recall, we have increased fees by CPI. We have increased by technology fee by 5% recently. And so how can we balance it? It's not a policy consideration to balance this out.
So I had seen your recommendation on making sure that if we have significant changes, that they be graduated on their implementation. And I think that's a very good concept, which reduces my concern, but far from eliminates it. And I just to toss out to my colleagues to start thinking about our process on this, because as a committee, the council would look for us to do the real deeper work on this, so that as a council as a whole, they're not looking at each and every one of these items. They may be responding to certain things that are a select portion of these that concern members of the council as a whole, or certain members of the council, but they're looking for us to do the legwork on a lot of this. But they're also, we need to think about what check-in points we need with the full council. Certainly the one that staff has recommended, which is at the policy level, that seems like a very appropriate one, and I would support that cost recovery policy would return to the committee and then go to the council, and then we've got that buy-in at a policy level. But part of that is going to need to try to think through the implications of a policy, which could be a far-reaching policy and have a whole bunch of consequences that we just didn't think through. And until it all starts to get implemented, we go, oh, we didn't really think that was going to happen. We didn't really intend it, but literally that's the implication of the policy. That's a difficult task. We all know you adopt a policy at a high level, and you got all these different programs. What's it going to mean? And trying to anticipate that is tough. And we've seen how tough it is just when we try and carve out one little section in a year in the past. And you haven't had to go through some of that in our community, but every community has some of this, but Palo Alto has a lot of it. And my attitude is that we need to accept that reality about our community and not say, gee, you know, why are people doing this? Let's accept it, anticipate it, and contend with it. And that means we're going to probably have more discussion and try to have more community dialogue and more dialogue with the council than you might ordinarily think would be involved in a revision to a fee structure in a community. I think that's my overriding notion of this process.
Chair Burt, if I may, I think you're raising some excellent points, and maybe I overread or reacted to the desire to get this in fiscal year 13. Some of the discussions that we've had internally, including with City Manager Keene, is decoupling the municipal fee schedule from the budget process. There's no need for the two of them to be married, and that way it would give us the focus and attention and necessary discussions with the community and surveys and whatever desires or direction comes out of the Finance Committee and Council eventually to have that process and that discussion. The fees can be incorporated at any point in the fiscal year. That's another point for us to keep in mind, that there's not a hard line.
And that's what you've really done too here. We had this discussion as a Finance Committee last year, and you're really following, you're not bringing this up at the time of the budget. We're doing it in our off-season as a Finance Committee somewhat, and I think that's great and entirely appropriate, and I really appreciate that. That gives us that opportunity, and you've been getting essentially, you said you perhaps had misconstrued. I don't think so. You're getting two competing sets of directions. One is that this is really important and we wanted to get this start coming back to the Finance Committee, but my recollection is that we wanted to start the process so that we would have an extensive period of time to be able to have real dialogue over it, as opposed to get it to us so that we could complete it real quickly. And maybe that's, and if colleagues can comment on that, because that's my recollection of committee intent and my own personal one, that I thought this was going to be very involved. So let's get started on it, and let's have feedback loops early on so that we can receive the information and give feedback, and it's an iterative process between staff and the committee, and then the committee and council, and all of us in the community.
And if it just, I think that's what all this means is that it is true that we can proceed with this. However, the budget does assume a certain amount of revenue from fees, obviously. And once the budget is set at that revenue level, we can make sure we bring it in so we don't have an unbalanced budget.
And we may have low-hanging fruit, too.
That's correct, yes.
Vice Mayor Shepherd.
Well, first off, thank you. I think that we do need to talk about this process, and yet at the same time, I am recalling that we did look at an experiment using the golf course with the way we were going to reallocate how the indirect costs are reappropriated to the various departments. And I don't believe that that has gone to council yet. This is just policy tonight. I particularly think that this report is really good thinking to start to integrate those two features going to council more quickly so that we can get them to accept the next job that we have to do, which is to go in and see the shock value of how these two methodologies are changing the way we might be applying it with our fee structure. Because when we come back and look at some of those ones that we're only recovering 50% or 25% for exactly the item that you pointed out with the fire alarms. I mean, I used to pay fire alarm bills all over the place. That's what they were charging us. So I would like to actually look at some of those to see how normal it is in other communities, and to call that out. But I think that that's the work that we can do after we can get our full councils and colleague members to at least agree to these terms of the methodology, the way we're in capturing the description between, you know, something that's perfectly private that I need to get as a permit level to, you know, how much of this is just a benefit to the entire community. And then if we can get them to agree with us with both how we're doing indirect costs and this type of methodology, we can go right into that shock value and look at these things at the line item level and just go, wait a minute, you know, this is concerning me. So
my notion, though, is that when you say it's just policy, I don't have the ability to take the abstraction of the policy and really have a good sense of its implication. And that's where, once again, as we did with the, you know, with the golf course, we looked at the overhead portion of it. Well, we have a similar scenario here, and we have some examples that we're beginning to
of how it's
to
playing
see
out.
here.
Yeah, exactly.
How it plays out, and that's where I think I'm not ready to say what looks like a well-thought policy is necessarily the policy we want to adopt, because we have a lot of implications that I'm not sure we have a full grasp of yet. And so I think we need to model that policy on a number of these areas and make sure that it looks like it's a fit. I mean, we can go through and intellectually in the abstraction, there's sound reasoning provided with the policy recommendation. But I don't know how that really plays out in the real world.
Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing with you on that. I'm just saying that if you actually want to allow council to move with us, we can't do a huge jump, you know, without getting them to kind of face. I think the material in this report, the MGT's report, is good, thoughtful material. And yet that's the policy, or that's the vision of a policy statement that we're trying to get to, and then just tell council we're going to go back in and look how this plays out and bring these anomalies up to see if the whole thing blows up.
Well, my sense, and this is going to be up to the committee, is that before we go forward to the council with a policy recommendation, we should do some of that screening to see whether that policy recommendation at least appears to be a pretty good match. It won't be able to be a perfect one. We won't know all the ramifications, but I want to try it out in this committee to go through and look at some of the ramifications in more detail through one shot before we make that recommendation to council. So if this comes back to the committee for review of the policy in November or whenever, I think we should virtually schedule a whole finance committee meeting around really trying to flesh this out and make sure we're okay to the extent we can anticipate things, that it looks like it's a policy that's going to fit pretty well, even though we may recognize that it's subject to change. We may also want to say whether it's a preliminary policy when it goes to the council. Should we really be adopting a policy before we've had the chance to really fully understand the implication of it? And I think I've got a pretty good sense of a number of the community values. I think everybody up here does, and I don't feel like I can anticipate all of this or anywhere near all of it.
But what role, I just want to ask you a question on this one first, and then I'll back out of this conversation, because
this is important dialogue.
I know, but I think there's two things that we've done here that could be huge steps. One, indirect costs. How are we applying the cost that it has to have the whole city services and reapplying that? Some of that explains the variances that we're having with percentages. I think that we have to get council to agree to think like we are, or we're looking at something that actually they don't like that step that we made. So that's what I'm saying by, this could be a draft recommendation, but have them agree that this is how we're going to handle indirect
I
costs.
suspect
and
it,
then,
but that's not all we're looking at here. That's not the policy concept. I mean, the indirect costs is probably the easier portion of this discussion.
but it's already calculated as to how they're aligning the costs now, that we're looking at to see some irregularities with how much we are in a
Yeah,
different
but-
balance than we were before.
But the policy is really it's centered around, what's on the bottom of page 3 and what's on slide on page 7. That gets to be the heart of a policy that has some broad impacts. And I think that'll be the contentious part, is how do we take this from a conceptual level to a reality? Yeah, sorry.
So there's just a few things I would like the council, perhaps it's clear to the council. First of all, when we set fees, even from the ground up, we do this always looking forward. What happens with the MTG report, we look backward. We look at actual data, actual activity, and actual cost. When we look forward in setting fees, we look at budgeted costs, what we know which are going to be. We look at activity which we estimate based on activity levels in the past. And based on that, we set fees. And based on the fee setting, it's the activity level times the fee gives me the revenue, which gives me the cost recovery percentage. So something which we really haven't done in Palo Alto in that detail yet. That when you see a municipal fee schedule come forward to you, that you actually see, based on the budgeted activity and the budgeted costs, that's what my cost recovery level is. So that's a piece which I think, if you understand you correctly, Chair Bird, what the challenge you're seeing, and I agree with you that you can have this challenge, and I appreciate your comments, that how to understand the policy framework and how does it play out. You have not been able to see that. Because that's something which you see when we have brought forward the municipal fee schedules in the past, if I'm correct, we did not give you the cost recovery percentages even by groupings. Okay, so perhaps, and I appreciate your comments about, I think you call them draft policy, I would perhaps call them guidelines. So we move away from the policy discussion towards the guideline discussion. So when we develop the FY 2015 schedule, we'll look at the guideline. If they make any drastic changes to me is by CPI. That's a drastic change for the communities. Communities used to CPI. If you go above that, we identify this before for you. The challenge I have internally is that administratively, there's a new process we're putting on departments. They've never done this before. The last time we did this was 7 years ago, and MGT has been very helpful in the report, and I'm glad we've done this because it really pointed out to us where we can do things differently and how we can do it differently. But going forward, I'm implementing a process with the departments which is quite labor intensive still. We hope that with a potential future acquisition for budget system that we can make this less labor intensive. So perhaps for you to allow you to give you that space, which I think that's what you're asking for, the policy space and understanding what does an abstract framework mean in specifics, that when we bring forward the municipal fee schedule, we obviously lay out the cost recovery levels. We don't necessarily change any fees above CPI. And as Lala said, there's no need to increase revenue at this time. We're doing fine for 15 per the last forecast. And then with that, you see the framework. And then with that, you see now, okay, if you look at arts classes, they're at 30%, they're at 40% on the budgeted level. Does it make sense to us to bring it too high? Or is it fine within the medium range as we are right now? So how does that would work for the committee as a recommendation?
So, and I do want to acknowledge that you're...
Chair, if
Yeah.
I could jump in here. Yeah, I agree with the notion that it would be good to focus this committee's effort on that policy framework, come back, have an intense discussion on it. I think the chair's made a good point that services are important to this community, and we have to deal with them carefully. But at the policy level, I think the consultant has made the point effectively that increases in CPI sometimes get out of line with what the cost basis is. And I think it's clear, the CPI in the last decade has gone up 2% per year. City costs, especially of personnel, has gone up by 5 or 6%. We are paying a large amount for retired people, for healthcare benefits, things like this. Now, what that means is if you get your indirect cost in and associated with this in a policy, what you're saying is our rates are going to go up 5-6% a year. And it may well be that in a couple of years we will not be competitive with the private market or what people can pay or want to pay for. Why should I pay that for an art class? So I think the policy should engage the question, how important are these types of services to building a community? And should they be based also in part of the the tax base of the community? That's going up at 5 or 6%, or property tax values. So maybe some subsidy from that tax base to build this community asset, which actually helps increase the value of that property, is useful. Now, what that might be is you come up with a policy that says these things should be run around a CPI increase, and maybe the share from the general fund goes up slightly each year. So the share covered in cost by the service user goes down a little bit. Now that's, a valid outcome. Maybe should be debated. But I think if you come out with a policy that says we are going to get the direct costs, we're going to get the indirect costs, we're going to get the city overhead on you, I think you'll have a hard time running it at a CPI rate. So I think that's one of the dilemmas we face. And the heart of that dilemma is what are city services? How much value do they provide to the citizens of the city? And I think the chair made the point that they are important. So let's make sure we don't lose that.
I just also wanted to mention that last year, I think the rates went up by 8% because we did an IT also. So it was CPI plus 5%, I think. So it was an 8% bump. Did we have any issues with any of the fees?
Not that it has come to my attention. The other counterpoint to that, and just fact, not counterpointing your point, is that we had not raised fees for a while either. Yeah. And so I think that's probably what made it palatable, and that we identify some projects for the IT funds.
I actually think that the way he's laid it out, that we do get to look at that very aspect by what kind of discount, 0 to 30%, I think is where it is, and some of them are at 0, some are at 1%. Children's Theater 25%. That to me, I think, is really an interesting ratio to look at for me, and to calculate when we get into that conversation, about how this all plays out with some of the mechanical changes we've made to do the indirect costs, which I think is a huge step, actually, a really huge step, because it's changed the course of the way we think about the golf course, and we're in the midst of, we considered the reconfiguration of the golf course with a different methodology, and now that's changed, and it's not changed to our benefit. So,
I think you both raised some excellent points, and I think I want to go back to what Walter said. We consider more of a guideline because we made some decisions years ago of what we valued in terms of services, and I think what we're trying to make sure is that we as a community look at those decisions again. They may stay in the same position that we put them in place when they were set forward, but it's time to revisit them because it's a different environment now, and it's not going to be a one-size-fit-all type of policy or guideline or guidance that we're seeking from you, because I think that's going to be important. It becomes an issue because then there's going to be the discussion, well, why does it apply to this fee and not that fee? So we'll have to have a good logical explanation, and then the outreach so that the community understand what the thinking behind the setting of those fees were.
So one of the things I wanted to acknowledge is that this process is clearly bringing us more and better information than we've had in the past to consequently struggle with. If we're blind to having really any good data, then we can make some pretty arbitrary decisions, and nobody will question them other than just on a value basis, that our values may be different from their values. But now we have data that we have to reconcile with values. And that makes it both ultimately a better process, but a more involved one and more complex. And that's what we're embarking on. So I certainly want to acknowledge that this is, I think, the soundest and most comprehensive foundation for this discussion that councils have had. In the past, we were making much more subjective decisions, not totally, and prior councils, they had other data, but this is a much more thorough process. I do think that as we get into this kind of chart, we have three broad categories, each with ranges, but this is where a whole bunch of subjective values intersect with objective information. I also did want to note that we should be conscious that as we have adjusted for proper accounting, first the IT expense, now recognizing that CPI was not really covering the increase in expenses, and then also this indirect cost, those three added together amount to major cost increases for these programs and significantly less general fund subsidy for the programs. So we're doing an accurate accounting adjustment at one level, but the cumulative impact is to say, and this may not be a deliberate policy intention, but the cumulative impact is, oh, you add those three together, and we will now be subsidizing all these programs a lot less. And that may be a correct decision, but we shouldn't just say that we aren't making policy decisions that affect the total subsidy, because they are technically correct ones, that there was an IT expense, that there is a greater inflationary cost expense than we were accounting for, and that we are now accounting for our indirect expenses better than we ever have. That changed the formula in a not insignificant way. And so I'd like to see us break that out and say, as a result of better accounting, we are looking at this level of increase in expenses for essentially all these programs. And it's a reality, and we may say that's the right decision to do, but we should look at it on that way and not just say, oh, well, those are just technical decisions.
Pat, if I'm correct in the way I'm thinking about it, is the IT now is banked into the indirect costs, so it's no longer going to be considered with a CPI increase or whatever, that instead they've gone in and taken care of the IT considerations with the indirect cost by trying to expense out the different departments. Is that correct, the way you're doing this now? So it will not be, I don't want to say it was made up last year as much as it just was, you know, a calculation to try to increase, whereas this year we actually have deliberatively taken the management costs and the overhead costs and your department's costs and figured out how to allocate that per type of service. And there was a couple different ways that we delivered those costs to the delivery of services. And I just want to know, did we ever take that thinking to council? Because I think that that's a huge step that we did, that I'm not sure council got to witness the incremental step.
No, because it has all been...
Bundled right here.
Right here.
Okay. And that's where I'm saying that I would like to just, this is draft still.
Well, let me
But
ask
it's
a
just-
clarifying question
yeah.
on that IT then. Remind me, if you would, Palo, when we made that adjustment, was it one where we were inadequately attributing IT expenses in general to these various services, or was it one where we were not balancing them or not fully correctly attributing them to specific services? One service we were maybe under attributing and another over attributing?
Really, what we wanted to do is reflect the cost based on the different methodologies of all these overhead expenses throughout the organization. So in some areas we had some of that, in others we didn't. For example, in the golf course, if you look in our budgets over the time, we've allocated the cost for all of those expenses, but it hasn't been a widely used system throughout the organization. And I think what this exercise has done is it has captured those costs and has reflected them throughout our programs where we provide services, which is, you know, something that we needed to do.
So in this, let me try and characterize it then. Is it that through that process of correcting that, did we standardize the allocation in a more consistent way?
We are attempting to do that, and then we believe that there's going to be some situations where you, the council, may decide that it's not the one-size-fits-all to some programs. And so that's why we're saying it's a guideline for the most part, with some exceptions in some areas.
So, okay, so then it's some form of a standardization with discretion.
Right,
Is that
like
right?
Gail gave you an example earlier that when we were talking about the community theaters, that allocating maintenance by square footage.
Right.
You may decide that that's not that
Right.
you may not agree
Right,
with
there
us.
were those two different ways we were doing it, that there was one by square footage and the other was by something else, and I can't remember. That's the step that I'm saying we have a little bit bundled into here, that I want to make sure that we keep our full 9 members of council abreast with us, so then we can go back in and noodle out those fees to see what we want to feature with that, with like, is it working or isn't it working? Because it's draft policy is what they're asking for.
So I get that, and I'm trying to get a reminder of how that played out.
I think, well, the 2014 fees are not built with that yet.
With the IT
With the IT,
reallocation.
they are.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
so on the,
the old
just for
But
the
not
moment.
with the overhead.
Okay, but, so just for a moment on the IT, so that I can have that smaller foundation on the IT part. When we did the corrections, were we, prior to these corrections, were we taking essentially the same IT overhead expenses that we have now and allocating them in a less systematic manner? Or were we under allocating those expenses?
So we, let me state, we believe we allocated in a proper manner to the funds. What we're doing is getting more granular and getting into the programs and allocating it to the specific program. So you know, instead of just saying there's an X dollar amount allocated to community services, there's an X dollar allocated to community services, but it is a piece of that goes to the.
So citywide, we're not changing through this process a change in the dollar amount that gets allocated to the programs. It's the method and how granular we allocate it. That's the change that occurred on the IT, you're saying.
We're trying to add more standard to go back to your comment on how we do things. We may have changed some things because there's some areas where there's very obvious methodologies that we've used, and that we, for example, payroll, paychecks. Well, we know where the people reside in terms of funds, so you do it by the FTE, where they belong. Computers, you know who has computers. There's other areas where it's a little more subjective, and we come up with a different
Well,
methodologies.
then maybe if you would, as this comes back to us and then to the council, as Vice Mayor Shepherd was advocating, so that that segment is able to go to the council with some clarity, if you would give some thought about how to describe it in a way that takes it at a high level and says, in summary, here's, in plain language, what we in essence did. And it sounds to me that there are several aspects to it. There's not a single simple statement that can capture it. Several aspects to it, but it's not infinite. You know, it's something that I think you can probably boil it down to one or two paragraphs in layman's language, so that all members of the public and all the council can understand at that level. And if anybody wants to burrow further, then certainly everybody can do that. But I
Well,
think
maybe we should ask to have a comeback, because I think there were 2 or 3 different ways that you were allocating ones. You're exactly right. Some don't need computers at all. It's not IT anymore. It's the bundle of overhead that every time you do a motion in the city, you know, there's a burden of Lalo coming and Jonathan coming with you in order to get that to execute. And so that's the methodology that you changed, which now has been aligned by the old boilerplate that we used to just do CPI increases, and then we threw an IT increase into the last time's fees, and now we're having a rebalancing act by actually changing our methodology by how we're considering fees. So maybe we need to re-see that and have them capture it the way you've kind of captured it here, so that we can have those bullets. And I think you illustrated it well, and this was quite a while ago, so I'm digging deep right now. But the golf course, I think, was the one we wanted to thread the needle on, because there's golf carts that are directly related only to the costs, and I noticed in here that they can have a surcharge, that we don't have to have a specific amount, that we can not overcharge, but we can charge market rate for that without having to tie it into the 26 prop. And then also, and yet at the same time, when we have the landscapers go out there to clean up the golf course, they come with the burden of you guys, you know. And so I think that there was, that they should just capture that for us and then take these 2 steps to council so that they can stay with us. And then we can go in and do the drill with the, why did this go up by 300%, you know, and really, is that, what are other people doing? That's what I would really like to see.
What I tried to capture from what you were saying at this next Finance Committee meeting on this subject before it goes to council, we would, and tell me if this doesn't capture it, have a summary of changes to the methodology of IT allocations.
I don't think it's IT. I'm not sure why
Is
you're
it-
using the
is it
word
not
IT.
IT? I'm
No,
sorry.
it's overhead is usually what it's
Really
called.
overall overhead?
It's overhead.
Okay.
It's
Sorry.
Just want to clarify one thing. So the technology.
Overhead.
even Jim Keen is in that overhead, I think. You
That's
know.
right. Or even if you get a stipend.
Okay, so it's
Oh, and us too. That's right. Our big salaries that we
Overhead.
have.
Big salary.
Okay.
The technology fee was a direct allocation of capital expenditures within the IT fund. Had nothing to do with
That's right.
running
I
the
remember.
IT
Yeah,
department.
I remember that now.
So just make sure we understand that.
Okay.
So it was basically, if we were to buy a new system.
getting telephones.
This, or new telephones, exactly. This would be a direct charge from the fee structure, recuperating from the fees, benefiting the general fund, and directly allocated towards expenditures in the internal service fund for information technology. So that's just one. If you look at overhead overall, what you were talking about, that's your IT department administration and staff, which gets allocated out. That's AST, that's HR, there's a complex system around there, how this works. It took me 2 meetings with my staff to figure it out, but I get it now. And it's fine the way it's done.
Just
you
don't
know,
forget it.
It's their methodology, it's just a different way of doing it. And it used parameters, which you mentioned. What's a proper cost allocation basis? And the basis could be number of paychecks issued, number of purchase orders
Right.
issued, number of positions serviced by the
Square
HR
footage,
department,
yeah.
square footage, and you really look from an accounting perspective, what's the appropriate basis? And that's why it can be different. So how, in essence, attribute the cost of certain
Right.
services, which internal service department provides to a direct service department, but in this case, a fee.
Okay.
Now, we have to summarize in the paragraph in the report.
Just refresh us. I don't.
So it's a summary of changes to the methodologies used for overhead allocations. Okay.
To the
And,
various services, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
to services. to specific services.
Because if we have to explain two things, that right there, which I like the way you've explained this here, so if you can explain it simple like that, because it is a little complicated, and this is where some people blow gaskets when they're trying to do finance. And that's why I'm just saying incremental steps, that one, and then this is a draft, is the way I sort of see it, and I think that it could go pretty smoothly at next finance, but maybe not.
Okay.
Christie, just
Yeah.
clarification. This was embedded in the 2014 budget, wasn't it?
No. The
Not in
Because
the-
I know
not in the fee
the,
schedule.
Now, maybe I should clarify. When you say this, you're talking about the 5% IT fee, or?
You did
Well,
do some of
if you
that
look at
methodology in
the,
this
the
budget.
The IT department had a decline in expenditures of 10%. The reason is for an allocation to the various other departments. Community services had an 8% increase. I think that was primarily because of the allocation of the salary benefit costs. So there already is embedded in the current budget some of these allocation processes. Isn't that right?
That's correct. Yes. Sorry, I didn't understand your question. Yes, that is there. What we haven't done is taken the guidelines that we have in draft mode and put it into with the 14 numbers. That's
Yeah.
what I was trying to.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, just to be clear that we are talking about what is in process.
So then another higher level question is in this staff recommendation where it says accept this report and MGT's draft report. And I wanted to get clarification on what the impact of that was, because Walter, you had said, well, MGT has certain recommendations in terms of recovery levels. And that's not what staff is yet recommending.
So basically the report was just acknowledging the report that you received it, that's the acceptance of the report, but does not mean that you're accepting recommendations within MGT. MGT has informed us with their work on how to proceed, and that made a lot of sense given the work they do with other cities and have done with other cities and counties, but does not necessarily mean that Palo Alto shall proceed with that.
Okay, so
And that's why we brought forth policy considerations which are built on MGT, looked at other cities, look what I've done in San Jose before, and based on that, come forward to you with those
good. So then when we get to the motion, maybe we'll add accept receipt of, just to clarify that we're not accepting conclusions. We are.
I think it says draft in there, so.
Yeah, just.
But I know what you mean, it's
When you've got the
confusing.
motion, you
I
want to
know.
make sure.
Yeah.
I would feel comfortable.
Yeah. But I think we're going to address both of them at the next finance so that we can just book,
Right.
bet it,
But,
and then they can go and bake it.
Right,
you know.
but the more we can accomplish tonight in feedback, the more productive that next meeting will be. So here's another level, a couple high-level questions that I'm not looking to resolve tonight, just want to pose. Within a number of the values here is the difference between who the recipient is as to whether it's a resident or a business. And we are clearly making distinctions in terms of how we value whether something, a service accrues to an individual or an entity versus more generally. And if it's residents, we're saying it's more general, or on our value basis, and I'm trying to look back at, well, under your first one, it says community-wide versus private benefit. And then elsewhere, and I'm trying to remember exactly where, there were references to kind of at the business level. And I think that that's probably reflects our values, but we really haven't quite figured out how to articulate the intellectual foundation for that. Say, why is that? And that's one of the things we should struggle with. And I think a number of the value-based overlays that are here I think are pretty well aligned with community values. Some of them we've been so far able to come up with clear rationales for those values, and others we haven't gone through that process yet. Just because we haven't come up with it doesn't mean they're not good. Those are the kinds of things that we should struggle with and figure out how to articulate. Why is it that we say this group is more important to subsidize than that group? And there is a good draft here, and I think we're going to really want to struggle with that and look at where there are still some gaps in our rationale. And just because there are gaps right now doesn't mean it's not sound. It's just we haven't figured out how to articulate it objectively.
We agree, and there's it's going to be more of a challenge, to use your term, when we embed the development impact activity fees with that discussion, because there's a lot of impact to commercial and the businesses in general, and I think some of it the answers that we'll provide you is the system that is used in the state for certain functions. And so we need to identify those and articulate that, like you said. And for the other areas, then we need to add clarity to that.
And I think at one level, in business, where the beneficiaries are there to have financial gain as the purpose, or the primary purpose of their existence. And
it was helpful to have those divided tonight.
Yeah, yeah. And that's different from individuals and residents whose this is the life that they live versus the financial gain part. Now, there are gray areas. I mean, when we do things that increase the value of homes, then individuals get personal financial gain as well. So it's not a clear black and white line, but I think that's certainly one of the distinctions.
And even within that, you've got renters and you have homeowners. I think
That's
you're
right.
laying it out in the proper kind of order and the right distinction. That's what I was thinking.
Well, it's a good point. I mean, if you think about it, even among residents, we could do things that increase property values for homeowners and increase rents for renters.
Yeah.
And so not all residents have the same impact on them. So no easy answers to these, but I think as we go through this process, laying them on the table and having an open discussion causes us to reflect and come up with sound rationales, and I think that'll be part of the process.
Yeah, I think it's helpful, your earlier comment about breaking things into categories. And obviously, some of the categories in community and animal services are separate. When you talk about parks and open spaces, when you talk about the wildlife control in the city, those are not services delivered to any single group, but to everybody. And so it should be not included in the same tables.
I'll move your motion.
Can I yeah, what, just all right?
No, I wasn't.
And I'll
I like
speak.
it.
That's okay, great. So, you want me to attempt to state what you moved?
You have it written down.
Okay.
Speaking of process.
So that let me try this and see whether this captures your intent. That staff will return to the Finance Committee not later than November with a summary of changes to methodologies of overhead allocations for specific services. They will return with a draft user fee cost recovery policy. And then we have tonight accepted receipt of this staff report and MGT's draft report. And I think that's all that would need to go in the motion. Does that seem correct?
I think so, except for when you say provide a draft of the cost fee recovery. Right here, they're just asking for policy considerations, not exactly going into. I want to go into the deep dive on those fees after we get our colleagues to agree with the thinking that we have with both how we're allocating costs. And so is that captured in your motion?
So,
Because
what
we're going to spend a lot of time on that.
didn't attempt to capture
yeah.
is what follows this. And what you're describing is what would then follow. It would then go to the council and then return to the finance committee for full review of the implications of that
Of the application.
draft user fee.
Right, exactly. That's how I'm thinking about it, because I don't
Okay, well,
really
we
want to
can-
go
we can
there
simply
until.
add that as part of the motion that
We will bring
this would be
forward to
the.
you a way of addressing this.
Great.
Let us think about this, how we can present this to you.
Great.
With timing, with process, 15 schedule, et cetera, so we can bring this to you as part of November recommendation.
Sounds good.
Right, like I want to have permission to go into that deep dive with fees only after we get our colleagues to agree with our thinking.
Yep.
Because that will be extensive, and I don't want to do it 3 times. I just want to.
right.
And then also, thank you. I love the concept of having some type of conversation about Cubberley with these types of thinking, with this type of captured thinking, you know, when we get into it. But I don't want to go into that conversation right now, but I really like the way you and Mark have brought that up so that we could then go, well, childcare, what kind of recovery do we want? And, you know, just things like that. I think that this is helping me think about that and gives me actually promise that we get to have that conversation as well. You know, because I think that there is ways that we can have it presented to us so that we can communicate it and dialogue on it. So anyway, that is, thank you for making that motion.
Councilmember Berman?
Yay. Oh, we're not voting yet.
Anything?
Nope.
Councilmember Schmidt?
Yeah, let me ask the maker of the motion to accept a change. This last part of your motion was the book draft user fee recovery policy. Now that has a connotation to it that the goal is to recover cost. And I thought we had been talking today about we want a policy for council to determine municipal fees, which, you know, might contain lots of things in it other than just cost recovery.
So do you have language change that you would recommend?
Well, what about just a draft a municipal fee policy statement?
It's just number 2 right here on the thing that I think, right, is that what you're provide input on user fee cost recovery policy considerations?
Yeah, I'm
isn't-
trying to get away from the term user fee recovery because that's a goal. And we don't want to make that the single
But it's
goal.
only the policy, and so the policy does vary between the categories, so I'm not bothered
so
by it.
I get the point that we don't want to imply that the intention is a full recovery, that the title of this has that implication associated with it.
You could use levels, recovery levels, or
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, good.
Exactly. Which is what we're talking about tonight. And
Right.
what you're presenting to us
So it would be
is levels.
draft user fee recovery level policy?
Categories
Or we're open. I understand your intent, and I agree with the intent, and I'm searching for language to capture that.
Good.
I think draft user fee cost recovery level policy. So it really implies that we're not, like you mentioned, it's not the intent to fully recover the cost, even 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because what the makeup of the community is today, and I assume will continue.
Good.
Is that close?
As long as you understand.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
And just, Chair,
Yeah.
Chair, just one question. When you say about specific services allocation, I think you mean specific indirect services, correct? In your motion, overhead allocation for specific indirect services.
I actually meant it how
I want to make sure I understand it.
it's
I think-
indirect costs to specific services is what I was trying to say.
Okay, I get it.
How you're applying
Got
the
it.
indirect
I get it.
costs.
Programmatic service. Yeah,
Yes,
that's the code.
programmatic services.
Thank
Yes.
you.
That's the big
Okay.
change,
So-
I think.
Yeah, perfect.
That, I had just a couple other, I think, I agree with the motion, Jay.
Get a 4-0 out of this one.
But I just wanted to add a couple other areas for us to be thinking about. So on bottom of page 3 of the staff report, Council Packet 48, it says consistency with city goals and policies. And so I was trying to think about, all right, what are we really referring to there? And we have council priorities, but that's not, we're not limited to that. We have, and this just says goals and policies. Well, we have in our comp plan sets of goals, policies, and programs, but goals and policies in the comp plan, but it's not limited to that either. We also have an intention to establish guiding principles, which has not come back to the council and was an important thing that was on this council's agenda for this year, and that would be an important component to this. So and there's probably other areas where we have established goals, policies, and values, and I think that's I would suspect we should at least have values, and then we may get skewered for claiming that we know what our values are.
I know, before we have our retreat on
That's
core
right.
values.
But I think, in essence, that's what we're trying to capture here.
That's correct.
So let's think about more about how do we describe what falls into this.
The low-income policy, for instance, I mentioned before, is in there. And really, as you're correct, Chair Bird, is a statement which captures not just today's council policy priorities, but allows the policy to be open to future direction from the council to incorporate that in the setting of fees. So it's a catch-all paragraph to allow it to be moldable for future policy decisions by the council.
Right. Good. And I'm sorry.
One can hope that by the time this comes back in November, we'll have had that discussion.
I think we will.
Which I thought I saw it on the
30th is, we're looking at the 30th
Yeah,
for the retreat.
so that'll help kind of.
Good.
Something else we'll recommend in there, let me think it through with the city manager, is the timing of the update of this process, because I think it's important to
Right.
tie ourselves to something like that as
I
well.
had a good conversation with the city manager about getting it on the agenda, and I'm glad to see it's there.
It's miracles.
Your term is still
just-
young, Mark.
Just to
You did it already.
and this is an example of the sort of thing that we'll have discussion as we get into particular programs. And I see Brianna's gone, but that's okay. We can just pass this on because we're not going to talk about it tonight. But for instance, I noticed under CSD that we have visual arts for youth and visual arts for adults, and music and dance youth and music and dance adults. And the cost recovery on the youth side is 2 or 3 times the rate of the cost recovery for adults. So in essence, we are subsidizing the adult community service at a much higher rate in those categories than we are the youth. That's the kind of conversation that we'll want to ask ourselves about.
But it's also one of the factors is market, and so it's there's a lot of different things. That's why I think that deep dive is going to actually be the kind of conversation I've been interested in having for years on council to try to, align all that. So I think
And
this
then,
is a good order.
And then here's another example, and this is my final one, on page 96. We talked about community benefit characteristics and personal benefit characteristics, and we may need to figure out ways to have greater shades of gray here. So for instance, under community benefit, the third from the bottom, it says diversity of experience, and I'm not sure what that is referring to, and it could mean something that is a real community value of creating social, economic, ethnic diversity in the community, or it could mean that, it's experience of
Programs.
programs, yeah. And that might influence to what degree I think it belongs in the left column or the right column. And then looking at things like we have mental and physical health for adults. That's called personal benefit characteristics. And there certainly are personal benefit elements to it, but it arguably has some of the same community benefits as some of the things on the left side. The only point being that there are some of these that will not be easy to categorize as A or B, and maybe like what you've done on user fee cost levels, maybe we need 3 categories because we got some tweeners. And so just to toss that out for consideration, you're going to have a few months to noodle this before coming back and having it dissected by us again. And so, so before we vote, I just want to say this is really some very thorough work, and we appreciate the quality of it and the quantity of it, and I don't want to have you misconstrue that the additional challenges that we may present to you are for lack of appreciation. That this is a deep dive in an important subject, and really appreciate what's going on this.
I appreciate the kind words, and I want to thank Gail, who's helped a lot tremendously on this and setting the stage for this before I even came in here, and obviously with the help of the consultant.
Great. So, all in favor?
Aye.
That passes unanimously. And Lalo, next meetings?
Future meetings. We do not have a meeting on October 1st. There were no items on the agenda, so it's a free night for you. In terms of finance, there is a meeting for infrastructure committee for those of you.
That's their problem.
On October 15th, we have the audit of contract oversight, trenching and installation of electric substructures from
I
the
will
city.
not be here then.
Okay, thank you.
So tell me again what's on October 15th, because if we don't have one on the 1st and Vice Mayor Shepherd's not here on the 15th, I kind of wanted to look at our scheduling and make sure that we're
You're going to make sure that I'm going to be here for the next meeting?
well, I just want to make sure that important items have as many members of the committee as possible here.
Is that the contract, the
Yes.
audit on contracts?
Yes, on that specific one, and that's the only item we have currently on the agenda. So we could either look for a special meeting in October, or it could carry over to November 5th.
So tell me again, that item is what?
It's from the auditor's office. It's the audit of contract oversight for the trenching and installation of electric substructures.
I'm sorry, when did you want to do that? October 15th?
That's when the
Okay, that's what I
acting
thought.
auditor asked, but
And it's not ready by the 1st?
I could ask. I don't believe so, because comments are due back September
Oh, that's
26th,
right.
actually, but internally.
So how critical is it to you to be?
This is a big one. Sorry.
So we could look for a special meeting in October, and we can pull for that, or we can move to November 5th, which has only
So-
one item.
I'll be back on the 20th.
Well,
Actually-
let's see, is Thanksgiving this year is that following week then, right? It's the week of, no, let's see.
That's in November.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Jumping the gun here. So, colleagues, if we were to look for either the 8th of October or the 22nd of October as alternative dates, do those look feasible, or are they ruled out for anybody at this point in time?
Just for logistics, the 8th has P&S
Oh, okay.
scheduled.
So then the 22nd, does that seem plausible?
Follow me.
Okay, so we'll poll, I just wanted to kind of float it first, since we're all here.
8th is good, and the 22nd is...
8th is not because of P&S, is what Lalo said.
Are there not other rooms, or?
Well, I think the city manager probably would want to
He's in
The-
Germany on the
Oh.
8th, yeah.
Oh,
22nd.
The 22nd, we're all back. So-
okay. Until, I obviously don't have this access to the city manager's schedule right now, so I will double check.
Okay, so
for
it
the
might be the
22nd.
8th or the 22nd.
Okay.
No, the 8th, I know he's in Germany, so that's,
Okay?
Okay, we'll check that. Then on November 5th, we are bringing to you the development impact fee. This process it's a multi-step process. The first component of it is to bring to you the approval list of infrastructure needs that staff has identified, so the consultant can then find the nexus and do a calculation of what, or an update of the impact fees itself. So the consultant will be here and explain to you what the process will be and the first steps that we'll have that night for you.
Great.
Mhm. The 19th of November is when we bring to you the financials for the year end, and also the year-end CIP status report. So we're bringing them to you a lot earlier, about a month earlier than customary. Our Laura Couric, our county manager, has been working really hard with her team to get this in front of you sooner than the customary. And then on Tuesday, December 3rd, we'll bring to you the first quarter financials where you'll see the encumbrance and reappropriation line items and on those numbers. And that's what we have for now, and as you know, the committee goes through this December.
All right, thank you, and meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Greg,